Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to today's lecture series brought to you by APAVM, the Asian Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum's Asia chapter. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is William Chang. Today I will be your moderator, stepping in for Lily as a case of tonsillitis, so just coming in last minute to support. Very happy to be here. Today, we have a very exciting program and lecture for you. This is, of course, our Road to Rome and the Vatican lecture series taking place this month in December. And today will be installment number 2. This lecture series is organized once again and sponsored by APAVM. Of course, this is lecture 2 of a 3-part series. And this lecture features the places that the Asian patrons have visited on 5 different previous trips to places like Florence, Assisi, Sicily, Siena, and Malta on our road to Rome and the Vatican. I myself have been on one trip in 2017. I think it was the 2nd or 3rd year, and it was a truly enjoyable trip. So we thank you again for joining us in the lecture series today. A little bit about APAVM and our history. Since our first trip to Florence, Rome, and the Vatican in 2016, nearly 130 patrons have been to Rome and the Vatican, back every year usually. Again, I went on the 27 trip, the second one, and already I would say was very immensely enjoyable and encourage everyone to come as well. Today we feature Siena, and next week, same time as today, lecture 3 will also feature Naples, which we will visit on our next APAVM Naples, Rome, and the Vatican 2024 trip next year, September the 26th to 5th of October. Today, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker. Well, before we introduce you, just to give you an idea of the 3 lectures that are taking place in December. Of course, last week we had Elaine Ruffalo speak for us, and today we will have Fabrizio Nevola, and he will talk about Siena, Renaissance Siena, a city of art, art for a city. Next week, we have Dr. Ross King as well, and I will talk more about that at the end of the lecture. As for today, it's all about Siena, really. And Siena is one of the most beautiful cities in Tuscany, or the most beautiful city in Tuscany, a medieval ensemble of palaces and towers cast in the warm brown of burnt sienna-colored brick. It has a very amazing and soaring skyline and features Palazzo Pubblico, which is the very center of Siena, and is 4 streets away from olive groves and orchards. Today, you'll be very interested to learn and learn about how Siena was a major artistic center during the Renaissance with close ties to Rome. Through the patronage of papal families, the city was transformed over the course of a century, retaining a distinctive style that looked back to both the recent past and to alleged Roman origins. Just a quick note, during this webinar, your camera and sound will be muted. And at the end, we also encourage you all to post your questions in the Q&A box. We will have 20 minutes to half an hour at the end for questions for Fabrizio. And of course, we welcome more questions. The more, the better. Thank you. Now, about today's speaker. Professor Fabrizio Nevola is a professor of art history and visual culture at the University of Exeter. His first book, Siena, Constructing the Renaissance City, was awarded the Royal Institute of British Architects, Sir Nicholas Pevsner International Book Award for Architecture. His most recent monograph is Street Life in Renaissance Italy, which was shortlisted for the Renaissance Studies Biennial Book Prize. More recently, through grant-funded research projects, including the Hidden Cities apps and the Florence 4D website, he has developed digital art history approaches using geodata, 3D modeling, and GPS technologies.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just double checking that you can hear me, but I think you can. So thank you very much for the introduction, and very impressive to see the important work that your organization has been doing over the years, and the restoration that your generosity makes possible. So I'm very pleased to be able to speak today. You'll have seen a few aerial shots of the city of Siena in the video that introduced the session today while you were waiting. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be speaking about Siena, mostly in the 15th century, so in the 1400s. That's 500 and something years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about the city that you probably know if you visited. So I'll talk a little bit about the Middle Ages, the medieval period, where the distinctive skyline of the city that you can see on screen at the moment was developed with its central bell tower and city hall. And then after that, I'm going to talk about something you perhaps know a bit less about, which is the connections between Siena and Rome during the Renaissance period. And I've given that a sort of subtitle, rather than simply Renaissance Siena art for a city, Renaissance Siena art for a city, 4 popes, 2 bankers, and 2 saints, who are going to be the main subjects and protagonists of what I'll be talking about. As you heard in the brief introduction, I've done quite a lot of my earlier work on Siena. The book that won the rather long-winded prize is Siena, Constructed a Renaissance City. You see that on the left, and was published by Yale University Press in the same year that I also contributed to the National Gallery in London's exhibition Renaissance Siena, Art for a City, and you can see where the title came from for this talk there. So both of those are sort of major contributions I made to the field of the study of Renaissance Siena. So just some very general stuff to get us started. Siena is a city in central Italy, central northern Italy. And today, obviously, Italy is a unified country since the 19th century. But in the period I'm talking about today, it was divided between many different, some very tiny states, sometimes described as city-states. That is, that there was a city at the center and they had territories of varying size around them. As you can see in the map on screen, there's a sort of purple, light purple band in the middle of the country, and that's the Papal State, stretching from Rome on the left, where obviously the Pope's headquarters were, and the center of the Catholic Church, across to the Adriatic Sea on the right-hand side at Ancona, and up as far as Bologna, so wrapping right around the Apennines. And to the left of that purple area is the very well-known area of Florence, the Republic of Florence, subsequently the Medici capital, Florence, of their duchy, and you'll have heard a bit about that last week. And then Siena in between. Here, as you see, Republic of Siena. Siena is one of the Republican city-states of Italy. That is, that they weren't ruled by an individual or family. It was always remained an independent city republic. The significance of Siena is in a way geographical. It's the last independent city-state before you enter the Papal States. And right from early times, from the early Middle Ages or even the late Roman period, Siena was a site where the routes that connected Northern Europe to Rome, one of the major pilgrimage routes of the pre-modern era. You've probably all have heard of the Camino to Santiago. Well, the Via Francigena, the road to Rome from Northern Europe, comes through Siena on its final approach to the city of Rome. And it's one of the reasons why so many people came through the city and gave it its significance. That same road was also the route that bankers traveled from Siena north to the places, the areas around Paris, which were some of the earliest commercial market areas of Western Europe. The city's kind of central relationship to the road running through it that cuts north-south across its hills is in a sense legible straight away from a map, such as the map that you're seeing here. This is the first map made of Siena, made in 1599. And you can see here both the representation of the city with that clear line running through the center of the city. That's the north-south route, cutting from the bottom, which is slightly confusingly at the north, to the top left-hand corner, which is the Via, the Porta Romana, the gate towards Rome. Wrapping along the top, you can see images of the Virgin Mary, and in fact, a slightly trimmed label says Siena Vetus Civitas Virginis, that is, the ancient city of Siena, city of the Virgin. And we'll come back to the Virgin Mary shortly. Right at the heart of where the streets converge is the city's central square. And here, sorry, I quite like black and white photos. This is a late 19th century photograph, one of the first aerial views of the city hall and square. And you can see here the point that was made in the introduction, the size of this city. Today, we wouldn't think of Siena as a city really at all. It still is considered a city. It has the kind of independence and local pride that goes with many cities, but it definitely doesn't have a 21st century scale. Even today, the city of Siena within its walls contains about 60,000 people. And that's about the same amount of people as it had, probably 50,000, before the Black Death of 1348. So right at the center of the square, of the city, is this unusual shaped square. We'll see its design shortly, but you can see that it isn't regular. And it faces towards the city hall, the Palazzo Pubblico. And you can see that the city hall is identifiable by its tall bell tower, its campanile, in Italian, campanilismo, the association of local people to their bell tower, is a way of describing local identity politics, the relationship of the people of Siena to their own local pride, just like the Florentines or the Venetians. So this campanile was intentionally very tall and very elegant, attached to this medieval town hall, which you can see is very open towards the street. Look at all the doorways facing onto the piazza. And that gives you an idea that this was a city that was safe with itself. It wasn't creating a defensive castle for its government, but it was creating an open palace. And you can see on the plan at the bottom right there, some of these internal rooms for that palace, which were all to do with large councils gathering to make decisions. Here it is in color. And in the color version of that building, you can perhaps start to pick out some of the black and white shields in each of the window frames, which is the coat of arms of the city of Siena, known as the Balzana. And right in the middle of that medieval palace, you can see up at the top the radiant sun of Saint Bernardino of Siena, who I'll talk about later, and who became famous and indeed became a saint for his prodigious quality as a preacher. Some of his most famous sermons were actually pronounced on the Piazza del Campo. Inside the city hall is a cycle of frescoes. Some of you will have seen these if you visited Siena, by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. These are important paintings in the history of Western art because they depict essentially a secular scene, a non-religious scene of good government in action. You can see the name of this room is the Hall of Peace, the Sala della Pace. And the objective of these paintings is to communicate the sorts of values and virtues that should be in place for a good government to preside in a city. And it's contrasted on its east wall with a set of very damaged paintings sometimes called bad government or tyranny. I prefer the term tyranny and its effects. And you can see on the right-hand side a devil-like figure at the center as the ruler, and he's labeled tyrannide, tyranny. And to the left, you see the damaged countryside and the winged figure of Timor, of fear. In contrast, the other walls that I've already mentioned depict the bearded figure of Ben Commun, of good government, or the common good, dressed in black and white like the shield of Siena, and controlled on the left-hand side by the figure of justice. You see the scales of justice being held by the figure of wisdom just above the head of the figure of justice there. And these virtues, which include justice, peace, fortitude, temperance, and magnanimity, these virtues should exist in a city that is well governed. And that well-governed city is what we're seeing here in the depiction of the city of Siena, perhaps even in the depiction of the Piazza del Campo itself, in a combination of everyday life, weddings, teachers teaching, merchants bringing goods into the city, and trading, as well as manufacturers. So this is very much a city which is defined by its professional and merchant elites. And through the doorway of that city hall, very secular images that define good government, we can see through the door to the great council chamber, where the image of the Virgin Mary in majesty, the queen of the city, presides over the great council chamber. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's a magnificent painting by Simone Martini of the same period. And so before I move on to the sort of next set of points that I want to make, I want to close by kind of reinforcing this idea that the City Hall of Siena is its defining feature of collective civic participation. That citizens associate themselves with this building. It's where they pay their taxes. It's where they might participate in government. There was quite a high percentage of enfranchisement of people who participated in government in this medieval city commune. And as you can see, the City Hall is laid out very much like the stage set running along the back of the square. It encloses the square, and anyone who's been in this square will know for a start that it isn't square at all. What you see on the left there is an aerial plan, and it's in fact a shell-shaped piazza, and it also isn't flat, it's curved. It's a little bit very much like a shell. It's curved from its upper edges and coming down to the flat space in front of the City Hall, again creating almost a stage-like setting. Anywhere on the piazza, if you face towards the City Hall, even in a crowd of people, everybody can see it, because it's like raked, a ramped enclosure. And one last point to make about theatre, as you can see on the plan, again on the left here, in the upper section, you can see that there's a curtain of walls that wraps around the piazza, almost making it like the experience of going into a cinema or a theatre, that there's one point of entry and then a stage set to enjoy that city piazza. And as I said, it's right at the heart of the city, at the convergence of the city's main streets, and intentionally is the most monumental, most visible and memorable element of the city. In terms of how cities get remembered or identified, buildings like the City Hall of Siena is very important. And, you can probably think of many places around the world where city halls are a defining feature of local identity and pride. But there are other elements which are key parts of how Siena defines its image, as I say here, fashioning urban identity, defining through artworks how people will remember and identify with the city. One of the things that's quite distinctive in the Lorenzetti painting that I started with, and you can see a sample of off on the left there, is that there's very little in the way of religious imagery. And in fact, it's thought that the little detail of the cathedral that you see top left of that painting was added in the later 14th century to kind of create a direct connection between the civic secular city hall and the religious center of the cathedral by actually representing it. Siena's cathedral is really distinctive, and I'm not going to be talking about it today in any detail, is really distinctive for its well, on the one hand, it's very early Romanesque date from the 12th century, but distinctive visually for its black and white striped design. This is distinctive of something called Pisan Romanesque, but it's also distinctive because the black and white echoes the shield of Siena that I already mentioned to you. The cathedral is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, specifically to the Assumpted Virgin Mary. So the Virgin Mary, as she appears going in glory up to heaven on the 15th of August, the feast of the Assumption, when after her death, she is brought miraculously up into heaven. So the cathedral is dedicated to the Madonna dell'Assunta, Santa Maria dell'Assunta, the Assumpted Virgin Mary. Its interior, if any of you have been in it, is extremely highly decorated. I always joke with friends like Elaine Ruffalo, who you heard speak last week, that the Cathedral of Siena is much, much more lavish than the Cathedral of Florence, which is instead much more famous, largely because of the dome. The interior is decorated in all its surfaces. And one of the reasons it is so decorated is that it was a very important religious site. It was almost like the reliquary. It held holy power for the people of Siena. And in part, that's related to the very small painting you see there on the left, the so-called Madonna of the Big Eyes, a 12th century painting. This early painting, as you can see, it's very stylized representation of the Madonna and Child, was very important in the history of the city. And that's why I'm showing you that manuscript there on the right. In this manuscript, you see the story of a very important battle in the city's history, a battle that took place in 1260, in which the Sienese beat the Florentines. It's known as the Battle of Montaperti, and it appears in Dante's Inferno. Before that battle, as you can see in this manuscript, on the left-hand side, the painting of the Madonna of the Big Eyes was marched around the city in majesty. Essentially, the Sienese people said, if you help us in battle today, we will make you the queen of our city. So you see her there on the left. Then you see in the middle, the battle scene. In the center, there's a little town labeled Montaperti. And then on the right, you see the people of Siena on top of the city hall celebrating the victory of 1260. On their return, the victorious Sienese soldiers, you can see them there with their crowns of laurel on their heads and trumpets, came back to the cathedral. And you can see the cathedral depicted in the drawing on the left and in the photograph on the right, what the cathedral looks like today. And they're obviously very, very similar. So they came back in triumph, and they went into the cathedral to thank the Virgin Mary for their victory. This victory, the victory of 1260, then became something that was celebrated regularly in Sienese life. And I'm showing you here two paintings, two quite different paintings. I'm sorry, I haven't labeled them. One from the late 1480s, so 1489, I think is the date, in which you see a painting, a representation of the city governor. Here, I think you can see my arrow here, the city governor, the head official, and the Cardinal of Siena, the Cardinal Archbishop, giving the keys of the city to the Virgin Mary. And you can see, quite interestingly, on this altarpiece, the Virgin Mary's hands are actually coming out of the painting to collect the keys. So this was a ceremony in which the Sienese literally gave the rulership of the city to the Queen of Heaven, to the Virgin Mary, their effectively elected queen. On the right-hand side, you see a similar scene in which, in a slightly more, if you like, more figuratively realistic way, the Virgin Mary has actually come out of the painted surface of the wall and is receiving the keys from the official. So you see this very tangible linkage between the Virgin Mary and the rulers and the ruling of Siena. Before moving on, I just want to make a further point about the Assumption, the Virgin Mary and the Assumption. And you can see in this battle scene, a battle scene dated, in fact, to the 1520s, you can see here the city walls and just about an image of the Virgin Mary, Assumpted Virgin Mary, over the gates of the city. The other images you see on screen, including the black and white printed image there, showed the Virgin Mary protecting the city of Siena. You can see its distinctive skyline beneath the cloak of the Virgin Mary, which is stretched out just like a Madonna of Mercy to protect the citizens. And the theme of the Assumption, of the image of the Virgin of the Assumption, remains a central theme in Sienese art. So as well as appearing obviously in the cathedral and on the northern walls, essentially the Virgin Mary in triumph, protecting the city physically at the city walls, the same image reappears repeatedly in paintings produced by Sienese artists for Sienese settings. We'll shortly see the setting on the bottom left for Lorenzo di Pietro, his Assumption from Pienza Cathedral. And I'll talk a bit more about why and when it was painted. But similarly, on the right-hand side, you see another Assumption image from one of the subject towns of Siena, the town of Asciano. So this imagery of the Virgin Mary as a Queen of Heaven is something which is very, very significant in Sienese art and almost has a political value. So that's the religious imagery. On the other side, in the Renaissance, as you know, also from that quite fun song at the beginning, humanism and the connections to classicism were becoming increasingly important. And you probably know, if you have visited Rome, that the city of Rome traces its origins to the foundation legend of Romulus and Remus, the two twin sons of Acca Laurentia, who were suckled by the she-wolf. Now, it might surprise you to know that some of the earliest depictions of the Romulus and Remus myth are actually from Siena. And I'm showing you on screen the first really famous such sculptural depiction, one made by Giovanni Turini. You see the bronze original at the bottom right, and in the black and white photos to the left, you can see how that sculpture was originally displayed on the top of a column right by the entrance to the city hall. Now, there's a really complicated story about why the Sienese claim their foundation origins to Romulus and Remus. And I'm not going to take you through every stage of that. Be happy to answer a question about it later, if you like. But the short story is basically that the Sienese claimed that they too were founded by the founders of Rome. For that reason, they adopted, in the Renaissance period, the wolf and twins as one of their symbols. No one had really worked on this, and this was something that I did new research on as part of my book, and made, as you'll see, I'll show you some other pictures of this, made a point of showing how it's during the 15th century, during the Renaissance, that the Sienese consciously revive this story. I say consciously revive, some people might say make it up. They adopt this story as a key part of their foundation legend, essentially giving themselves a Roman foundation legend. Wolf sculptures, such as the one I've just shown you by Turini, started to be erected around many sites in the city. The one on screen now, you see the actual surviving sculpture from the 1470s made by an artist called Neroccio dei Landi, not so well known outside of Siena and specialist artistic networks. You see a drawing of that same sculpture on one of the squares near the center of the city at the intersection between the city hall and the cathedral, in the drawing on the right. And below it, you see the modern reinterpretation of that she-wolf sculpture produced at the beginning of the 21st century to replace the original, which is now housed in a museum. So she-wolf sculptures became a distinctive feature, marking different parts of the city, almost always erected on the top of a column. And here, in a map that I made for my book, you can see at least the ones that I was able to locate, a number located around the city center, the cathedral, the town hall in the middle here, up at the cathedral over here, but then also on the extremities at the city gates. And the point of this is really that, in a way, it's a form of quite subtle but obvious propaganda, getting visitors coming through the city to notice this connection of Siena to Rome. As I said, travelers were very often on their way to or from Rome when they were coming to Siena. And so the connection between Rome and Siena is created at the level of images, just through references such as the one I've just been showing you. And it's not just these travelers, pilgrim travelers. I'm not just suggesting that they traveled through as a quick stop. It was a very important stop on their way to Rome. Siena had a very, very successful, large hospital in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And this hospital was designed above all, yes, to provide services to the local population, but above all, to support the large numbers of pilgrims traveling through the city. And the paintings of the Sala del Pellegrinaio, of the Pilgrims' Hall at the center of that hospital, are essentially to be seen by the pilgrim travelers who would have slept in this decorated. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about popes and other patrons. The key figure in my talk really now, I mentioned 4 popes. I'm actually going to talk about 3. The 4th actually precedes the Pope, Pius II. It's Alexander III, and he's back in the 14th century. But Siena, for such a small city, surprisingly had 4 popes. The first really important one of these popes is Pope Pius II Piccolomini, born Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and celebrated in this spectacular painted room, the Piccolomini Library, that any of you who visited Siena will almost certainly have seen. It's a room that was painted from 1503 by an artist called Bernardino di Betto, known as Pinturicchio. So he's a predecessor of the generation of Raphael and Michelangelo, but as you can see from the colors and the style, very much a Renaissance painter. A painter who in this room is on the one hand quoting classical Roman ruins in the vaults, but on the other is primarily telling us the story, the biography of Aeneas Silvius, who then became Pope Pius II. This extraordinary room, as I say, is decorated from floor to ceiling with maiolica tiles on the floor, choral books wrapped around its walls, which is why it's called a library. So these were manuscript music books, and then frescoes. Here I'm showing you the wall which shows Aeneas's life prior to entering holy orders. And on the far left-hand side, you see him as quite a dashing young man on a white horse. He was a humanist, a scholar, and he had a very good career, essentially in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Frederick III. So here you see him actually going to Austria and Switzerland to the Council of Constance. The second scene shows him slightly unusually in Scotland. And then on the third scene here, you see him being crowned by his boss, by his employer, as a poet laureate, as the greatest literary figure of his generation. So that's actually his background, is as a scholar. As we turn across around the room, the short axis essentially shows us Aeneas Sylvius ending his role as a secular member of society and joining the church. And I'll come back to this scene later, but you see him here in a scene where he's actually officiating at the betrothal of his former employer, the emperor, and Eleonora, the Princess of Portugal, right in front of the city of Siena. Then you see him being made a cardinal. And then on the rest, the facing wall, we have his life as a pope, which we're going to look at shortly. Among the various scenes, apart from his coronation as pope in the Church of St. Peter's, an important scene I'll come back to is his creation of St. Catherine as saint, as St. Catherine of Siena. As I said, the room is extremely decorated, including the coat of arms shield of the Piccolomini in the floor tiles, and you can see here stained glass windows and the coat of arms of the Piccolomini prominently displayed both in the windows and in the vaulting. So this is a monument to Piccolomini achievement. Just as a reminder of some of the detail, Pinturicchio is an artist famous for his ability to depict immense detail, richness of color. On the scene on the right here, I think you can really clearly see the skyline of Siena prominent on the hillside, whereas in the foreground you've got these portraits and the bishop's mitre of Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini at the center there. So Aeneas Sylvius was crowned pope, appointed pope in 1458, and he reigned not very long. He reigned for 6 years to 1464. You see him in one of these quite distinctive Sienese paintings on the left there, with the city of Siena beneath him. The Sienese were very, very proud of the fact that Pius was Sienese, and in a sense, they almost make his papal appointment an event of Sienese significance. You notice here that it's not just cardinals that are crowding him, but it's the Virgin Mary. And to the right, you see the shield of Siena. So this is an image which kind of makes a papal event a Sienese one. And you can see his portrait here, which I'll come back to a little later, from his house in Pienza. Pius II is also remembered as one of the first nepotist popes. You may have heard of the word nepotism. It's basically the word for advancing your relatives. Now people speak about it in relation to Hollywood actors advancing their relatives. The term, at least used in the UK and the US, is nepo babies. Now, Pius did this for his relatives. In Siena, he basically built his two sisters huge palaces on the left and on the right, are buildings which he had constructed largely using papal funds, which were channeled to his relatives to construct some of the largest palaces of the 15th century. We usually think of Florence about this, but actually this is in Siena, and the Palazzo Piccolomini on your right there is almost as big as the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. The Palazzo Piccolomini, which I'm showing you here, was originally built for Pius's sister, a woman called Laudomia, and eventually was inherited by his two nephews, nepotism, Andrea and Giacomo. They had quite different buildings, one facing towards the city hall onto the Piazza del Campo, the red building on the top, and the other facing onto the main street towards Rome on the bottom in white stone, white cut stone, very much a Renaissance style building. They also built a loggia, a family arcade, with the coat of arms prominently visible along the front, the name of Pius II, who had brought fortune on the family, right up at the top, and a set of benches, bottom right on the screen, a set of benches which are covered in the coats of arms of the family. Again, very much a display of family achievement. One of the things I always enjoyed sort of discovering as part of my research was this palace on the left, the Palazzo, as you can see from its modern label there, it's a contemporary art museum now, known as the Palazzo delle Papesse, the Palace of the Papess. Now, obviously, this isn't got nothing to do with the Pope S. This is the palace of Pius's sister, Caterina Piccolomini, for whom a palace was built, basically a copy of the Palazzo Medici in Florence, which had just been built. So my feeling has always been that Pius II saw the palace of Cosimo de' Medici, the richest banker at the time, and said to himself and to his relatives, that's the grandest palace in Florence. I can make one of those in Siena, and I'll give it to my sister. Instead, for himself, he built an entire city. It's a very small city, but to this day, it's known as Pienza, which means the city of Pius. And on the map up here, you can see Siena, Florence here, Siena, and Pienza in South Tuscany. Pienza is essentially the small town at the center of the Piccolomini's family estates in southern Tuscany. And you can see in this slightly saturated image the beautiful landscape and richness in olive oil and agriculture that landscape produced. At the center of the small town, he built a huge cathedral. So this village, today there are scarcely 1,000 people live in Pienza, in the historic center of Pienza, but it's still a cathedral town. The town of Pienza was elevated to a bishopric. This huge cathedral was constructed, and to the right, a new palace, a family palace for Pius to live in himself. You can see this is very much in the grand Renaissance style. The cathedral is very unusual because on its facade looks like a Roman temple, and its interior is like a German Gothic cathedral. It's very distinctive and unusual in the history of architecture. And inside the cathedral, he brought together some of the leading artists in Siena of the time. And each of them produced in the year 1462 an altarpiece to a very modern layout, this rectangular layout. They created an altarpiece each, very often showing saints of a Sienese significance. So, for example, here you've got San Bernardino on the left. Giovanni di Paolo is perhaps the least successful of the four painters that we're going to see here briefly. Sano di Pietro is much more decorative in style. You can see the rather beautiful carpet that the Virgin Mary and Child are seated. The throne is resting on this very beautiful carpet. But the most impressive of the paintings really are those by Matteo di Giovanni, which you see here. Very realistic, almost in the style of an artist known, much more famous artist, Piero della Francesca, who in fact Matteo trained with. He was a real master of perspective. And the painting that I showed you a little earlier by Vecchietta, the Assumption of the Madonna and Saints, which was painted for the high altar itself. And here, interestingly, on the right panel, you see Saint Pius, a precursor of Pius II, a Pope saint, looking at Saint Catherine of Siena, who he had made a saint himself. Pius actually did most of his patronage, most of his spending on art in Siena and Pienza. He did very little in Rome, partly because Rome was quite a complicated city in the 15th century. People hadn't yet re-established any sense of order there. And his main contribution was to create a now completely destroyed loggia, open arcade, on the front of the Church of St. Peter's, which is what you're seeing on the right there. And very consciously, this triple arcaded loggia imitated the Colosseum. So it was imposing, if you like, the imperial splendor of ancient classical Rome onto the facade of the Basilica of St. Peter. And actually, quite interestingly, and that's what the quote on the left-hand side in Latin is, Pius II was the first pope to legislate for the protection of the antiquities of ancient Rome, the prisca aedificia et illorum reliquiae, the beautiful buildings and relics of this ancient Roman period. I'm going to make a brief interlude now to talk about a couple of saints who are significant in the history of the Catholic Church and in the history of Siena, and who emerge in the 15th century. You may well have heard of both Bernardine of Siena and Catherine of Siena. Bernardino has perhaps slightly less following these days. Saint Catherine is actually the patron saint of Europe, and is quite widely venerated, and a reason for many people's travels to Siena is to actually visit the shrines. I'm showing you here in the on the left and right some of the early paintings of Catherine on the left and Bernardino on the right from the City Hall, and you can see where they come from there in the black and white picture on the left. So I mentioned that the City Hall was originally decorated with the Virgin in Majesty, this painting here, but over the 15th century it was embellished with depictions of local saints, as well as important battle scenes, victories of the Sienese people. So Bernardino is shown in his very distinctive guise. He clearly favored an ascetic life. He didn't feed himself very much, and he preached. And in his preaching, he showed this monogram, the name of Christ monogram. It's Jesus abbreviated there. And his preaching was really what made him famous and what got him his canonization. He was very unusually canonized the year that he died. So you've got the dates there on screen, and the paintings on screen were actually painted the year of his death in 1444 as part of the case for his canonization. And you can see him here preaching in front of the City Hall on the right and the Church of San Francesco, because he was a Franciscan, there on the left. And so successful were these paintings, these sermons, they were actually repainted in similar scenes by different artists in the 1480s on the bottom right and in the 1520s on the top right. The other significant saint of this period is Saint Catherine of Siena. Saint Catherine was canonized as you can see on screen, she died in the 14th century. She was a mystic saint. She had various visions, but on the other hand also was quite politically involved in corresponding with the papacy. But she was only canonized in 1461, so 80 years after her death. And she was canonized, as you can see in the scene, by Pinturicchio there on the left. She was canonized by her by Pius, who canonized a Sienese saint. So he consciously set out not just to, if you like, advance his relatives, but also to advance the memory of religious figures from his hometown. Back in Siena, that canonization was marked by the construction of a new church, this beautiful little church in Renaissance style, dedicated to St. Catherine, which in its interior is adorned by this sculpture by the artist Neroccio di Bartolomeo, who you've seen other works by as we've been going along, of St. Catherine and her Dominican habit. And there are many sculptures of this sort. And this is where I'm going to end this particular part of the talk by saying that Saint Catherine and Saint Bernardino were such key figures in the 15th and 16th century, and actually right through to the present day, in the religious life of the Sienese, that this created, if you like, almost like an off-the-shelf market for paintings for local, personal, private devotion, in which the Virgin and Child are at the center, and Catherine and Bernardino alternate on the left and on the right. Here I'm just literally showing you a screenshot from Google, just to give you an idea of quite how common these paintings are, and from what a broad chronological range they come from. The larger one on the right is from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, is probably one of the better quality paintings of this sort. So I'm now going to just talk for the last few minutes about bankers and the road to Rome. So in the background of Pius II, I'm going to mention Pius III in a minute, are bankers. You've heard a lot about the bankers last week, about the Medici, but actually it's important to realize the Medici were not alone. Almost as rich as the Medici were the Spanocchi. No one has heard of the Spanocchi, literally nobody outside of specialists. And yet Ambrogio Spanocchi, whose palace you're looking at, was every bit as rich as Cosimo de' Medici. And he was the banker for a number of popes right through the 15th century, as well as for the King of Naples. So he was a prodigiously wealthy and important political and economic figure in 15th century Italy, and in fact in Europe, because as banker for the King of Spain, King of Naples, he was also banking in Valencia for the kings of Spain. This huge stone palace is his monument, constructed as a place to retire to in the 1470s. And he was so ambitious in his self-image that not only did he use his coats of arms, but he uses portraits of emperors up in the vaults here to, this is Ambrogio here, and around him of Roman emperors. And that gives you a good idea of what he thought of his own status. He thought that through wealth, he'd almost acquired imperial status. And that paintings that are made for this house essentially reinforce that idea of status through essentially echoing stories from ancient Roman times. Here you've got a story of Alexander the Great and a banquet, very much the sort of banquets that Renaissance patrons would put on. Indeed, these paintings now in London in the National Gallery seem to evoke the wedding celebrations of Ambrogio's two sons that took place at the time that these paintings were painted. And just like major patrons in Florence, the Spanocchi were major patrons of their local churches. So here, the high altar, decorated by Florentine artists, the Damiano, of the huge Dominican church that you see there on the left of San Domenico. Now, among others, the Spanocchi and the banking family I'm going to mention in a minute, the Chigi, were bankers to Pius III. Pius III, as you can look at the dates here, did not reign a long time. He was Cardinal Archbishop of Siena, appointed by his uncle, Pius II, for most of his life, and reigned, as you can see, for less than a month in 1503. It's said that Julius II, the patron of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, wanted the job so much that he poisoned him. But here you see him commemorated in the Cathedral of Siena, his coronation here. Of that same generation, there are a number of other families that are important and where the last 2 or 3 minutes of my talk are going to be dedicated. You may remember in the she-wolf I showed you here, in the background of that image of the she-wolf is a palace, not particularly distinguished to you, originally painted with very beautiful frescoes on the left on its facade. And this is the palace of the Borghesi. Now, the Borghesi, quite important in Sienese life, really important in the life of the church. Can you see the same name on the pediment, on the triangle in the center of the church of St. Peter's? Paulus Quintus Borgesius, Paul IV Borghese. This is the great-great-grandson of that same family who moved to Rome in the 1550s and essentially led to the creation of this new lineage, which led eventually to Pope Paul V, who completed the facade of St. Peter's. The last figure I want to mention today is someone else, different family, again, a banking family, the Chigi family. The Chigi were actually business partners of the Spanocchi, who I showed you earlier. And they owned a house just by the Piazza del Campo. That's the Campo in a very bright background. They also had a house that was originally frescoed. All these frescoes are lost. I'm not going to talk about their house any further, other than to say that they also had a very beautiful country house, the Villa Chigi, just outside of Siena. Again, somewhere that very few visitors visit. And yet it's important in the history of art, because as you can see, it was designed by two architects. One you may not have heard of, well, you may have heard of neither of them, but Baldassare Peruzzi moved to Rome in 1505. And he moved because the same family, Agostino Chigi, the person who was to be the wealthiest person in Europe in the early 1500s and the banker to a number of popes, Agostino Chigi wanted him to build a villa for him in Rome. And you can see there are very clear similarities between the villa in Siena and the villa in Rome. This is now known as the Villa Chigi or La Farnesina. It's one of the real gems if you have a chance to visit it in Rome, right by the river Tiber in Trastevere. And it was designed by Peruzzi and decorated by Raphael above all. The interiors, as you can see, are decorated with very high Renaissance style frescoes of the feasts of the gods here, images of secular mythology. Here, perhaps one of Raphael's early masterpieces, the so-called Galatea, in which the goddess, the nymph Galatea, is brought in across the sea on a shell towed by dolphins. This is almost like Botticelli revisited 30 years later by Raphael in this very, very elegant open loggia room. And at that same palace in turn, and this literally gets me to the end of my slides, you noticed a villa, late 15th century, early 16th century. The same family of the Chigi built one more villa at the end of the 17th century, Villa Chigi at Cettinale outside Siena, perhaps one of the most beautiful villas of the Baroque era, and that was built by the family of Alexander VII Chigi. Don't worry, I'm done. Alexander VII Chigi was the main pope of the Baroque era, and he's the person responsible for the piazza and its enclosing arms, which you see here in a drawing by Bernini on the left, and as it was realized on the right. So again, a way of thinking about the connections between the enclosing arms of the Piazza del Campo on the top and what became perhaps the most famous Baroque piazza in Europe, the Piazza San Pietro, the piazza in front of St. Peter's. So connections that link together Siena and Rome through people, art, and architecture. I hope that makes a good ending. That's where I'm finishing. Sorry if I've gone on a little longer than I intended. 53 minutes, so we'd said 50. I'm sorry, a couple of minutes over.
No problem. No problem. Thank you, Professor Fabrizio, for the rich insight into the city of Siena and its cultural and religious history. I thoroughly enjoyed the lecture, and I'm sure everyone did so as well. So now we'll take some time for a Q&A session. It's probably going to last between 20 to 25 minutes. Fabrizio, I'll kick off with the first question coming from me, William. What is your number one place or art piece to visit in Siena on a continuous basis? And what makes it so memorable for you to keep returning back there?
Well, I started out early on telling you a bit about the Lorenzetti frescoes, in the Palazzo Pubblico, with images of good and bad government. Those paintings remain for me one of the highlights of any visit to Siena, and to be honest, I go there anytime I go to Siena. I go and see those. I would say a slightly more hidden gem, which many visits don't include, is the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala that I mentioned in passing. I don't know if your visit to Siena included a visit to that hospital. It's right opposite the cathedral, and it's extremely beautiful and very imposing, surprisingly imposing building. It's a huge complex, which actually goes about 3 or 4 levels underground. But on its first floor level, which includes a church, it has frescoes created over the period of about 100 years, which are really very, very memorable. So I would probably put those as my hidden gem, and the Lorenzetti as my go-to top Sienese artwork.
Okay, great. The second question comes from Bruce Hemmingson. How is it that the art of Siena between the 13th and 15th century had such a strong Gothic influence?
Okay. Well, I think one of the reasons is that actually during the 13th and 14th century, it was a quite widespread artistic style adopted, to some extent brought in from Northern Europe, but adopted through a lot of Italy. I think, and so in that sense, Siena is participating in an artistic movement that lots of other parts of the country are also involved in. The thing that is often said about Sienese art is that taste for the talking not just about pointed arches, but an enjoyment of rich materials. So gold backgrounds, for example, are very common in Sienese art right through the 15th century, as you'll have seen in my painting, in the pictures I showed today. Was a real attention for remains in Sienese art right through the 1400s, and maybe in Florence they're not so interested in that. And I think the reason for that is that it's something very distinctive and Sienese. They remain very attached to that way of painting. And one of the reasons they do that is that they want to look different to their neighbors in Florence. I mentioned in the talk this idea of campanilismo, this association of people to their bell tower. And it is a really important and valuable way of thinking about how competition existed in these city-states. It's perhaps not that helpful to think of it like football, but it's not that wrong either, in that these cities have rivalries, that the people may all come from the same, broadly speak similar languages, but they compete in a very felt way between one another, even if they're nearly neighbors.
Okay. The next question is from Francis Tan, and it's a question that I also had in my mind as well when I was looking at the slides. Is the ceiling painting for Pius II reminds me of the Sistine Chapel ceiling as well. Did Michelangelo draw his inspiration from the Sistine Chapel ceiling from the Pius II ceiling?
That's a really interesting question. So Pinturicchio's work precedes Michelangelo's work, so chronologically, that's a possibility. Michelangelo would have seen the Piccolomini library. I knew that I was trying to cover too much stuff in the time that I had, but one of the works also commissioned by Pius III, so the nephew of Pius II, was actually a set of sculptures from Michelangelo, and Michelangelo only completed part of that commission for essentially for an altar in the church. And the reason he abandoned that project was that he went to Florence to make David. So it was a good reason that he left the job unfinished. So Michelangelo definitely saw the library of the Piccolomini. In terms of I think the thing that is also really important to notice, and it's quite easy to notice, is that Michelangelo makes a step change. Pinturicchio is an artist who's very interested in minute detail and imitation of the ancient Roman houses. They'd recently seen ancient Roman ruins. For example, the Roman house of Nero had been discovered by artists, and that's what they're imitating, for example, in the vaults of the library ceiling. Michelangelo does something very, very dramatically different. And one of the things he does, obviously very famously, is that he uses scale in a very, very different way. Much, much bigger figures, which are much more legible from the ground. So it's much less miniature in composition. But yeah, Michelangelo did have knowledge of the system of the Piccolomini library, and was very much inspired in many ways by art that he saw in Siena. There are other works that were very important in his oeuvre.
Okay, great, great. Siena is well known for its annual paleo horse race. Can you firstly sort of shed light on what that is exactly, number one,
Yeah,
and
of course.
two, what's its origin and who participates in it, and what is its
Yeah.
significance to Siena in Italy?
Yeah, well, I didn't include the palio in this talk because I mean, I do a long version talk with the palio included. The palio is a very unusual and very distinctive horse race for some people, particularly for animal rights activists. It's a very medieval race that should not be run any longer. For the Sienese, they claim that the horses in the palio race are the most protected horses in the world and the most loved horses in the world. It's one of these classic things, a little bit like the Grand National in the UK, that divides people's opinions around how the horses are treated. The palio in short, is a race that takes place twice a year, on two Marian festivals, on the feast of Santa Maria di Provenzano, which is the 2nd of July, a local festival, and on the 15th, in fact, it happens the day after, on the 16th of August, in honor of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. A horse race is conducted on the Piazza del Campo, around the outer edge. They lay down earth, brought from the countryside. The distinctive brown burnt Siena earth is laid down nowadays by dumpster trucks, and they put a layer of earth about this thick so that the horses aren't racing on cobbles, they're racing on compact earth. And the race traces its origins back to the 1300s, maybe even earlier. But in that period, it was run along a street rather than in the piazza. However, there is almost continuous history of that race from the 13th, 14th century to the present day, with some periods of interruption, including during the World War conflicts of the 20th century. It's fiercely competitive. Today, it's run between the different districts of the city, known as the contrade. In the period that I was talking about today, it was largely run by horses that competed on behalf of the leading families, the banking and noble families of the cities that sponsored horses. In fact, in some cases in the Renaissance period, it was a bit more like a Formula One race, that there were the big families of Italy would send a horse to the palio. So the Medici, the Dukes of Mantua, would send a horse. So it was almost, it was a competition that was not local only. It wasn't uniquely local. So that horse race has its origins, as I say, in the past. Today, it's run twice a year, and it's fiercely competitive between the districts of Siena, each of which have a set of colours. So their horses will have those colours, a sort of heraldry there. And the one thing that's people are often surprised at is that it's the horse that wins a palio, not the jockey. So a riderless horse often wins the palio, and it's the horse that is celebrated in a victory, not the jockey. The jockey is a paid employee of the district, of the contrada, but the hero of the day is always the horse, and the horse is always brought into the church after the victory, to celebrate the victory and thank, just like that key giving ceremony, to thank the Virgin Mary for her support of that victorious horse. So it's a very peculiar thing, which is both intensely religious in some ways and also extremely secular and pagan almost, this celebrating of the horse at the center of that ritual.
That's a great
If you get a
cultural.
chance to go, you should go. It's amazing.
Okay, what in what months of the year does that take
The two
place?
races happen on the 2nd of July and the 16th of August. So it's the summer. They usually have they put down the earth for about a week to 10 days before, so that there are trials in the days before, but the trials are always unimportant, but they're fun to see. And the piazza, the middle of the piazza is filled with standing public, and it's actually free to go into the piazza, but extremely a little bit, it's not good if you're claustrophobic because it's very, very crowded. And otherwise you can pay for tickets on the stands that are erected around the edge of the piazza. And if you're very lucky and or willing to pay quite a big ticket, you can go and watch from one of the windows of a private house. And it's yeah, it's an amazing experience. I've seen it from the piazza, from the stands, and from a house. I've seen it 5 or 6 times, but I haven't been for quite a while, partly because of the horse question, but it's an amazing thing to see.
Okay, thank you, Professor. That question was from Andrew. I didn't mention
Thank
that
you, Andrew.
earlier. And there's another question from Andrew here, and I think you might have touched upon it earlier. It's about the rivalry between Siena and Florence. How and why did this rivalry occur? Maybe if you want to talk a little bit more about that. And did these two twin cities drive any common objectives, collaborate in trade or in the arts and religion?
Well, I mean, it's not that unusual, is it, if we think about rival commercial cities for them to be quite close together. I mean, in the UK, there's a very, I think, almost like the most obvious example comparison is Manchester and Liverpool. You know, they both have big football teams and they have huge industrial roots in you know, in the Industrial Revolution, and they have different trading vocations. In the port vocation of Liverpool and the industrial one of Manchester. And Siena and Florence are not so very similar. And I'm sure I'm not going to start trying to think of other pairs of cities, but there are plenty of them around the place. And Siena and Florence were nearby rivals from the very beginning. They both were doing quite similar things. They both had big banking families. They had trade and industry. Florence, in the end, triumphed in terms of scale. It became the larger city. And in a way, the reason for Florence's triumph over Siena is that the Medici family essentially, because they rose above the Republic, they took it over. They then created the ambition to create a state in a way that previous to the 1550s, Florence and Siena were quite able to coexist. So there were skirmishes, there were occasional battles on the border, but they basically had an agreement to to let each other alone and just to get on with the business of making money to some extent, right? In terms of rivalry, yes, there were moments of major military rivalry. I mentioned the Battle of Monteperti is probably the most famous, 1260. It's a really long time ago. But the rivalry was often not military rivalry. It was commercial and, in a sense, image rivalry, that they had very different ways of doing art and architecture. And that rivalry, often rivalry is something that makes people push themselves further, right? And so I think the Florence-Siena rivalry is something that, in a sense, resulted in the fact that these two cities are remarkable cities for art and architecture, because they were pushing to have the more beautiful, the bigger, the more important cathedral than each other, or the better set of walls, or the more distinctive style of art, the best sculptor. These rivalries come up at various moments. For example, in a period I've been talking about, I didn't talk about it, but the rivalry between Donatello and Jacopo della Quercia, or later, there are plenty of them. So that rivalry continues as almost like the kind of lifeblood the competition between the two cities, between their artists and their leading families.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. I picked some unique ones. This one here is from Kathy. She's fascinated about Eucharistic miracles.
Okay.
She's heard about the miracle of Siena, but doesn't know much about it. What, how, and why did it happen? And in your opinion, is that a significant Eucharistic miracle? And in your opinion, what is the biggest significant Eucharistic miracle?
Gosh, so I'm trying to think which the Eucharistic miracle in Siena is, in terms of, because, so I think I might need Kathy to tell me which one she's referring to. I mean, ones that are famous from this period are the miracle of the Mass at Bolsena, which is celebrated in Raphael's fresco in the Stanze in Rome, in the Vatican Stanze, in the private apartments. Pius II was very important in the promotion of the Corpus Domini, of the theology that the body, well, the host is the body of Christ at the Eucharist. It's not a representation of the body of Christ. And in fact, he established that theology, the theology of the Corpus Domini, at a council, the Council of Mantua of 1459, in which it was created as a dogma of the Church. Pius was responsible for two main new pieces of dogma. One is around the Eucharistic sacrifice. The other one is around papal monarchy. So the idea of the Pontifex Maximus, of the fact that the Pope is a single leader with single authority, as opposed to the conciliar view, where the Pope is a representative of the College of Cardinals. And so in that sense, Pius was very, very important in establishing certain parts of the theology of the Catholic Church. But I'm not a theologian. So those are the things I can speak to Eucharist are those. If there's something else, you probably need to have a bit more information. But
Yeah,
the other thing, yeah, go on.
no, if Kathy wants to reach out to you,
She's very welcome to
do that.
to get in touch, and we can you can all find my email very, very easily on my university website. If you just put my name in the website, I've only got one person who has the same name as me, who really pops up high on Google, and he's an actor in a kind of mafia documentary sort of crime drama. You'll see he doesn't look like me. He's a bit younger, but you'll figure out which one I am if you search for me at the University of Exeter. So do get in touch.
Okay. The last question from Mr. John Ong. He's referring to the paintings of Saint Bernardino. You did notice that the men and women are segregated in public space in the paintings. Does this represent a cultural norm in Siena at that time in the 14th century?
That's a very good observation. So so those paintings refer to the sermon cycle, famous sermon cycles of 1427, which were actually recorded by a scribe. And actually, it's kind of the reason that I ended up being a researcher. I probably would have done I was an undergraduate at the University of Oxford, and a lot of my peers went off to be bankers and lawyers, and that's probably what I would have done anyway. In my year, I did a year of study in Florence, in Siena, I mean, and I went to the library one time because a lecturer said that I could actually consult the original manuscript of Bernardino's sermons. And for me, it was like one of those moments where you actually touch something physically that has historical meaning. And it took me straight back to those sermons of 1427, which I found absolutely amazing and fascinating. Anyway, so that's my little personal biography. But the 1427 sermons, we know a lot about them. And in those sermons, Bernardino was famous for his preaching, because he doesn't just comment the scriptures. His sermons are peppered with comments to the audience. And we know absolutely, not just by Bernardino, but from all sermons of this period, and actually going to church in this period was usually segregated. There was usually a curtain or divide between one side and the other of the church, or one side and the other of the piazza. Sermons took place outdoors when there were huge crowds that couldn't be fitted into a church, so they would spill out into the piazza outside. That's one of the main reasons that piazzas were kind of invented outside churches, was essentially for an outdoor bigger space to accommodate crowds. Often churches would have a pulpit outside the church so that the sermons could take place outdoors. And both inside and outside the church, the segregation of men and women was very, very common. Right through the 15th into the 16th century. In the 16th century, it's part of the Tridentine reforms. So the Council of Trent, which is essentially the response to the Reformation, various things were legislated on, including the fact that the laity should take the Eucharist more often, and that there was some legislation also against limiting the segregation of audiences. But broadly speaking, the period I'm talking about, always segregated. Women would always wear head coverings, and the idea was that you were not meant to be distracted by the opposite sex while you were thinking about holy thoughts and
Sure.
and that sort of thing. So there you go.
Got it. Yeah, that's that brings us to the end of the Q&A session. Thank you, Professor, for answering all the questions.
Well, thank you.
There may be some further questions at the end, which will have to be answered through email. So please reach out to Professor if you have any specific questions. So now I'd like to introduce our next couple of speakers, actually, Daniel and Vivian Lee, who I believe are based in Hong Kong. And they are going to talk about their personal journey as an Asian patron, and really share about their trip earlier this year to Malta, Rome, and the Vatican. Vivian and Daniel, over to you.
Okay. I will be speaking on behalf of Daniel. So thank you, William, for your introduction. I'm delighted to share some of the highlights of our wonderful 2023 Malta, Rome, and the Vatican trip, which took place between April 28th to May 7th this year. Beauty ever ancient, ever new, were the words Ben Chang used in his welcome letter to launch the 5th APAVM chapter visit to Malta, Rome, and the Vatican. True to his word, what awaited us was beauty beyond compare. A truly privileged, awe-inspiring, and unforgettable experience that exceeded all expectations. Without exaggerating, it was a trip that beat them all. Originally planned for 2020, this trip was postponed several times because of the COVID pandemic. A record 39 patrons came on this trip, which began in Malta. A destination often overlooked, Malta's past importance came to life with the history of the Knights of St. John, the holy and militant order which made their home here for more than 2 centuries. Our schedule in Malta was jam-packed. Not only did we learn about the history of Malta, we saw many of the fine arts that were associated with Malta. As an example, we were able to view the famous Caravaggio painting, The Beheading of St. John the Baptist, at the Baroque St. John's Co-Cathedral, and heard of its spiritual and artistic significance. So this is the only Caravaggio painting that is signed by the painter. We also met a modern-day knight of the order, the engaging Dr. Philip Random, who gave us a lecture in a first-person eyewitness account of the historical events. He certainly made history of the Knights Come Alive. We also went to 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the Haga Im, a Neolithic temple complex, which shows ancient man's mysterious ability to place huge slabs of stone on top one another to build places of worship. The second World Heritage Site is the Hypogeum, a subterranean 3-storied structure hewn out of rock that was used as a burial ground as well as a place of worship. Leaving Malta, we flew to Rome. Okay, this is the Hypogeum and the Hagaim. Yes. All right. So after that, we left Malta and we flew to Rome. Here, I can only give a few highlights of the visit. The main highlight for many of us was the Pope's general audience in St. Peter's Square. That day, we set off early for the Vatican. As patrons, we were given special seats in the front rows on the side of the same podium where Pope Francis sat. The excitement of seeing the Holy Father close up gripped us. We then visited the restoration labs of the Vatican Museum. We witnessed the painstaking restoration work in the mosaic, paper, painting, and tapestry labs, and saw the patrons' donations at work. The second highlight was the visit to San Clemente Basilica. There, the learned Father Paul Murray welcomed us with a thoroughly thought-provoking talk. Why remain in the church today? Okay. Then we went to the Angelicum, the Dominican Pontifical University, and this was a very special visit because Pope John Paul II also studied here. Here we met our dinner companions, the professors and the students studying theology, philosophy, and canon law. During dinner with them, the conversation was naturally stimulating. And the striking location on the top floor loggia of the Casa dei Cavalieri de' Rodi, overlooking the ancient forum, made it all the more special. Every day was exciting, but the most special day was when we were given a private guided tour of the Vatican Museum and the Apostolic Palace. Entering the Apostolic Palace itself, we were ushered into the Pauline Chapel, a most private chapel of the popes that is not on any tourist itinerary. On the walls were 2 Michelangelo frescoes, the Conversion of Saul and the Crucifixion of St. Peter. And we were told it was before the second painting, the Crucifixion of St. Peter, that Pope Francis prayed immediately after his election as Pope in 2013. The grandeur of the Pauline Chapel was only surpassed by the adjacent Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's masterpiece. As we stepped into the special place, and having the chapel exclusively to ourselves could rightly be called an experience of a lifetime. The final highlights were the walking tour Baroque Ecstasy, which took us to several churches where we got acquainted with Bernini sculptures, notably the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which you see on the upper left, the architecture of Borromini, and of course, the painter of Chiaroscuro Caravaggio. Our guides, Elaine Ruffalo and Jill Alexi, are experts and scholars in their field, and their commentaries were of the highest quality. Privilege is a word often used to mean special, but it is not used lightly here. What we saw, what we learned, whom we met, the venues where we were taken to for dinner, none of this would be open to us were it not for the arrangement of the patron's office in the Vatican and the planning of the APAVM of Chairman Ben Chang and his wife Kim. These privileges were accorded to us for our small part in supporting the Vatican Museum, conserving and restoring beauty, ever ancient, ever new, for future generations to enjoy. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for sharing your wonderful experience on your recent trip this year. Like you, I'm sure everyone had a good time on that trip, and obviously we encourage everyone to sign up for future trips. Now, I'd like to just quickly, as we are wrapping up here, talk about next week's lecture, which is the third and final installment of the lecture series this month. It's called In Search of Redemption, Caravaggio in Naples, Sicily, and Malta. Our speaker is Dr. Ross King, and the lecture will take place on 19th of December, which is next week, exactly the same time and the same day. This lecture will provide a comprehensive understanding of Caravaggio's artistic journey throughout Naples, Sicily, and Malta, highlighting the impact of his work in each location. We'll look especially at his life and his work in Naples, a vibrant city that was instrumental in shaping his artistic career and solidifying his reputation as a groundbreaking painter. Finally, we examine his turbulent personal life, whose circumstances brought him to Naples and then inevitably led to his subsequent flight and eventual death. Dr. Ross King will be our speaker next week. He's a best-selling author of books in both Italian and French, art and history. Among his books are Brunelleschi's Dome, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, and Leonardo and the Last Supper. His study of the origins of French Impressionism, The Judgment of Paris, was published in 2006, and his biography of Claude Monet, Mad Enchantment, in 2016. He serves on the Council of Academic Advisors for Friends of Florence, the fundraising charity ensuring the survival of Florence's art and architectural treasures, and is also a prolific speaker, regularly lectured in the Smithsonian, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Frick Collection, the National Gallery of Art, and the Telfair Museums. When not traveling for work or pleasure, he lives near Oxford, in England, with his wife, Melanie. Be a patron of APAVM. Of course, everyone here is familiar with, this slide specifically. The details here for adult single, adult couple, and family. And of course, we encourage everyone to join on an APAVM trip at least once. It's truly an immersive and just a fun trip, really, a good mixture of culture, history, food, and knowledge. So please do sign up. And of course, you can contact Isabella Tang and Irene Kwong on the details there. So do join us next Tuesday at the same time, same place for the third and final installment of the lecture. This slide really ends the lecture. And of course, once again, we'd like to thank not only Ben and Kim Chang, but also Professor Fabrizio and all the back office staff and of course our audience, the guests and members like yourself who have attended here today. Once again, we thank you very much. APAVM thanks you for your patronage and your sponsorship, and we do look forward to seeing you next week and on the future trips. Thank you very much.